Hi, my name is Jameson Ordway. I'm with the Turing School of Software and Design, and today I'm going to walk through an addition to the set list app that we're building as part of the backend program in Module 2. So today, the first video that Brian made was about how to make an index page. So you could go to a web page and see all of the songs that we have in our database with their title, their play count, and their length. Today, what I'm going to be building is a show page, which will allow us to go to a page for one specific song to see the title of that song and then the artist that that song is associated with. So the first thing that I'm going to need to do is triple check that I'm on the correct version of Ruby. So I'm going to do that by typing ruby-v, and Ruby 2.7.2 is what I want. So the next thing is I did not work on that index page, so Brian did. So I'm going to need to go and grab this repository and clone it down to my machine by going to the GitHub repo and copying this SSH link to clone. And then I'll say git clone and paste that into my terminal wherever I want that directory to live. So when that clones down, I'm going to cd into that directory. It should be set list tutorial, just like the name of the repo. And I think the first thing I want to do here, well, first I'll just open up my text editor with this. And maybe I'll close this out and open it up again because that's not what I expected. Yep. So here we go. Now I'm all set with all the folders and directories I would expect from a Rails app. I have my gem file open. I'm going to go ahead and run bundle. This is the same as running bundle install. And that's going to make sure that I have all these gems, these packages installed and ready to go. And then let's see. So I think the first thing I want to do is actually write a test, which we haven't done yet. And I'm going to need a little bit of setup in order to be able to write and run tests with RSpec. We already have the gem pry for debugging, and I'm also going to add a few gems in this block specifically, the group development test, because we'll be using these in tests and we may also need them in our development environment too. So the first one I'm going to add is going to be rspec-rails. And we're also going to use a gem called capybara. If you have worked with RSpec but not capybara, essentially what you need to know here is that Capybara gives us a way to use RSpec to interact with our web pages the way that a user would. So doing things like visiting a URL, clicking on a button, Capybara is going to let us automate that whole process and test that everything's working. So another gem I want to add is Launchy. This gives us a keyword save and open page. And when we put this into our test, it will launch an HTML page wherever it hits this so that we can see visually what the test or what Capybara is quote unquote seeing. And it can be really useful for debugging as well. We'll also add simple cov, and we already have pry. I think that's everything we need. So now I'm going to run bundle again. Give it a second to install all of those. And with RSpec, since we're setting this up on our app for the first time, we're also going to need to run a command called railsg rspec install. It's like so, railsg rspec :install. And what that's going to do for us is add a couple of configuration files that Rails uses to just make sure everything's connected for our specs. And it is also going to create a spec directory at the top level of the app. So at the same level that we have app and bin and config and db and all these things, we also have a spec folder to hold all of our tests. Let's see. So I think the next thing is going to be to create a features directory within spec. So I'll say make dir spec features. And then I'll be saying touch, well, I'll get to that in just a second. Before I get too far into writing a test, there is a little bit of configuration I need to add at the top of Rails helper. So right here at the very beginning, I'm going to require simple cov and put simple cov.start. I might not actually get into anything to do with SimpleCov today, but SimpleCov is a great tool for just being able to quickly see how much of your code is covered and tested. So I do have a user story that I'm going to be using to determine the behavior of what we're building today. But as I think about just where I want this test to live, and I'm doing my test-driven development, I know that we're going to be building a show page for a song. And if I look in our app models, we have a song model. And if I look in app controllers, we have a songs controller. So we're going to be kind of adding to that functionality. And what I'll do here in spec is I'll make another directory. And I'll call that directory songs. So all of our feature tests for a song, how a user would interact with songs resources in our application are going to go in spec features songs. They're feature tests, and they're tests that have to do with the songs resource. Now I'm actually ready to create my test file. So I can say touch spec features songs, and this is going to be show_spec.rb. It's really important to remember to put the _spec after the name of your file for the test, or our spec won't know to run it. It won't run your test, and you could get some false positives in your test coverage. We really want to make sure that these are running and failing if anything's broken. So here I'm going to just go ahead and require Rails helper. I'll do that at the top of every spec. Then I'm going to start an rspec describe block. I'm going to say rspec describe the songs show page and give that a block. And then I'll need a it block, and then this is going to describe the behavior, and that'll be a do and an end. And I just realized I have a typo. This should be rspec.describe. What are we doing? We're showing a individual song, and it should also show the name of the artist that made that song. So it displays the song title. And I consider the song title being displayed and the artist being displayed as two separate tests. So what I'll do here is I'll stub that out. I'll say it displays the name of the artist for the song. And I'm not going to give that a do and an end. I'm just going to let this be a pending test. I'll come back to it when I'm ready to write it. So the first thing that I would do as a user, and I'll pause here and talk about feature tests just a little bit. Feature tests are meant to test behavior as a user would experience it. So if we think to other types of testing in object-oriented programming and Ruby and RSpec, you could have like a unit test or an integration test, right? And you can, I would think of model tests, which we aren't getting to today, as testing the smaller units of behavior. They're unit tests. And then a feature test is more like an integration test because it's testing the final behavior of how everything should act on the website, how a user would experience your site. So this is where Capybara comes in and allows us to let the test, or tell the test to go visit this page. So the first thing that I'm going to do is say, and I'm gonna tell it to visit what I think my route is going to be. That'll be visit songs. So if we just went to songs, this would be the index page. But I'm going to a show page. So what I'll do is I'll say songs, and then I'll give it, actually, this should be in double quotes, and I should be able to say visit songs, and then interpolate song.id. And the idea here is that this is like going into your browser and saying, hey, please go to localhost 3000 songs 1 and give me the first song. Now, in order for that to work, I'm going to have to set up some test data. So I think what I'll do is I'll just give this, I'll make this in a regular local variable. There's no need for this to be an instance variable yet. And I'll say song equals song.create. We need a title. Let me grab the data from the lesson plan. Yep, I think we'll call this I really like you. And we'll give it a length of, let's say, 8 and a play count of something. That'll work. And then I should be able to visit songs/song.id, which in this case would probably be song, or the ID of 1 for this song that we created on line 5. Now, before I go much further with writing these tests, I think what I'll do is I'll run this, and I expect it to fail, and then we'll talk about why. So I could just run rspec and run my entire test suite, but I'm going to be a little bit more targeted with that. I'm going to say rspec and then run spec features show spec. Oh, song rspec spec features songs show spec. Okay, so I'm running rspec spec features songs show spec. And it tells me database set list test does not exist. So what I can do here is say Rails. I wonder if I just need to do db create, or if I need to, I don't remember if I have this already. I might have to drop and then create again. But no, it looks like it says created set list development and created set list test. So this error just popped up because I never created a database for this app. Now that I have one, I should be able to run the test. Let's see how that goes. And here's our first error. It says no route matches get/songs/1. So I am going to use this information. This is, a great way to start my test-driven development and say, all right, I don't have that route. I should go to the routes file. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to use my fuzzy finder and say routes. And right now we just have a route to go to the songs index. So this is what I want to pause here a little bit and talk about routes. Routes in Rails this is a pattern matcher that we're interacting with. I like to think of this as like, I have a reservation at a restaurant and I go into the restaurant and the host probably has like a list of people that have reservations. And you can think of that as like these routes that we're matching to. And I would say, hey, host, my reservation is called songs / and then like an ID of a song. And assuming that that exists in the reservation book, then the host can map me to like a particular table, say, right this way, you're going to be sitting over here. And to translate that analogy into Rails, what Rails is doing is saying, yeah, I know about this path, or I know about this URI. We would use those terms interchangeably. And I know that I should send this HTTP request to songs show. So breaking that down again, we have this incoming HTTP request, which is a get saying, hey, I would like to read a resource. I would like to get a resource. And then the URI or the path is /songs. That's the name of our model. And then we have this other segment, which is dynamic. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But this is going to be the ID of the song. And because we have defined this here in the routes file, it knows to send this request to the songs controller and the show action. So the show action will be like a method inside of that controller, and it will determine what HTML to render. So yeah, this is each one of these pieces of the URI or the path is a segment. They're separated by slashes, and we can make these whatever we want. So I could say something like get show me, oops, I need a leading slash, show me the songs. And I could send that to songs get them. And I could call my action in the controller get them. And this would all work just fine. But there are conventions to how we prefer to do these things in Rails. And the example on line 4 is how we would do a standard show page. So that's that. To take that even further, we could make something like get show me the songs to songs, display them. And like I mentioned before, when we have a segment that has a colon before the keyword here, that means that this segment is dynamic. It could be anything. So if I had this route defined in this routes file, like so, I could go to localhost 3000 and say show Jameson the songs, and that would be valid. It would match because this is a placeholder. You can think about it as behaving similarly to a variable, but it's just represented here by the colon and then the keyword that you would call it. And then you can place any value in that segment of the route when you're visiting the page. So this could be, that would also match. It can be anything. Let me get rid of those. Actually, so that would match my example that I just gave there. This would match if I did, could I duplicate that line? I could do show Jameson the songs. I could do show nothing the songs. And I could not do something like, I couldn't do show me the songs. This would not match because here we have a static segment. It has to be show. And this is the dynamic segment that could be anything we want it to be. So any of these would match. So this one would not work. The rest of these would, with the pattern matching in the Rails routes file. One thing to note here is that the dynamic segment in these routes, and I'll go back to our really good example here. This might be referred to as a symbol. It looks like a symbol in Ruby, right? But it's not truly a symbol. This is a specific syntax for the domain-specific language of the routes file. And we might say that as DSL, domain-specific language. So the routes file specifically knows to treat this as a dynamic value, but we might refer to it in passing as a symbol because that's kind of what the syntax looks like to us as Rubyus. So that's a little bit about dynamic routing. Let's go ahead and run our test again because now we have the route that our test was looking for. And let me actually split these side by side. So our test is trying to go to /songs/song ID. When we ran the test last time, this was 1. And what I would expect now that I run the test is that my test will visit this. It will send an HTTP GET request to /song/1. And that request will essentially get here to the routes file and find a matching route, get /song/something. And then it will go to the songs controller show action. So I think we'll get a different error if I run this test now. And now we do get something different. We get abstract controller action not found. The action show could not be found for songs controller. So what this tells me is that we got to the songs controller, we got all the way to here in this HTTP request, but then the songs controller didn't have an action or a method defined called show. So that's where our error is coming from. I'm going to move on from the routes file and open up the songs controller. And all I'm going to do is add in a def show. And I'm going to run that test again. So now we get yet another error. Songs controller show is missing a template for this request format and variant. So whenever I see this error, I know that my app is looking for a view that it can't find. Now, by convention, I know that Rails is going to be looking for a view called show in a directory called songs, because the views will map to the names of the controllers the view directories will map to the names of the controllers, and the view file names will map by default to the names of the actions in that controller. So what I'll need to do is go to views and add a show.html.erb in that songs directory. So I'll say touch app views songs show.html.erb. And now we have a show page, which put there for now. It doesn't have anything in it, but what I'm going to do is go ahead and run that test again and see what error I get. And I don't get any errors because at this point, all my test is doing is visiting the song show page. That's great. We're in a good spot, but I'm going to go ahead and add to my test now because this is not getting at the full functionality that I actually want to build. So at this point, I think it would be good to take what we call a user story. I'm just going to copy and paste this from a resource that I have available. And I'm going to comment it out and use it as a guide in the test expectations that I'm writing. So I'm just going to Tap that over a little bit. So as a user, when I visit /songs, oops, this is the wrong user story. I apologize. Let me grab the correct user story. There we go. As a visitor, when I visit /songs/1, where 1 is the ID of a song in my database, then I see that song's title and artist, and I do not see any other songs in my database. The user story describes the functionality that we want to build and how the user would interact with it. So I want my tests, my feature tests, to very closely replicate what is described here. So I already have, when I visit songs/1, this is basically accomplishing that. Then I see the song's title and artist, and I do not see any other songs in the database. So I have a test ready to go here for the same thing. But in order to test this, I am going to need to create an artist for the song. So that's going to involve a little bit of other Rails stuff, but for now, I'm going to put it into my test as artist equals artist.create. And we haven't run a migration to add an artist model to our app yet, but I think really all we need for an artist is a name. And I think this is Carly Rae Jepsen. So if I run this test right now, we'll get failures that have to do with this resource not existing or that model not existing. So I'll just run that test to demonstrate what kind of error we would get. And it says uninitialized constant artist. So very similar to the last video where we had to run a migration in order to create the concept of a song in our database, we're going to do the same thing for an artist. I'll say Rails G migration create artists. And they'll need a name, which will be a string. And I believe that is the only attribute that I want to add. Now I'm going to open up that migration. And I am going to go in here and edit the migration just to include timestamps. Timestamps. I think that's all I'll need. So I will say Rails DB migrate. Cool. So now we should have artists. Those should exist. All right. So I have run this migration to create an artist. And now what I would like to do is actually create another migration so that I can associate artists and songs. An artist should be able to have many songs, and every song should belong to one artist in our app. So what I'll do for that is I'll say Rails G migration add artist to songs. And what I can say is, I always have to think about the direction that this goes. I believe it'll be artist references. Let me run that and see what we get. So now I get this migration that has a change method, and it's saying add reference on the songs table, referencing an artist, and this is a foreign key. So the primary key, artist ID, artist.id on the artist table would be artist underscore ID for a song. And that way a song can refer to an artist that it will belong to. So let me try migrating this. And that looks great. I'm going to double check my schema to make sure that this did what I want. Sometimes the syntax can be a little bit confusing and not very intuitive. So we have our artist table that just has a name. That looks great. And then we have our songs table with the title, length, play count, and an artist ID. And then this line that tells us that it's indexed on artist ID. We don't need to worry too much about that. And here we see we have added a foreign key of artists to the songs table. So that looks good to me. The next thing that I'm going to do quickly here is make sure that I have an artist model. So I'll say touch app models artist.rb. And here I'll make sure that that's inheriting from, that's a class called artist, inheriting from application record. And I want to go ahead and set up an active record association between these models, as well as adding the foreign key with a migration. So what I'll say here is has many songs. An artist can have many songs. I will also need to add the other side of that relationship to the song model by saying a song belongs to an artist. Cool. So now I think we are actually good to go back and look at our spec again. This is kind of how we started all of this. We should now be able to create an artist. And now that I have this association set up, I can actually say artist, the variable for this artist that we created, artist.songs.create. And what that will do is it will create this record and automatically associate it with the record that it was called on. So this song should now belong to this artist. Okay, that was quite a bit of setup, but let's continue adding some assertions to our test here. So we know that we can visit the song show page. What do we expect to see when we get there? Well, we expect to see the song's title first of all. So what I'm going to say is expect page to have content, and then we will say song.title. And this is some pretty specific, or at least the have content piece, and expect page. These are things that Capybara lets us use as assertions or expectations. Okay, and then the other side of this test is that I don't see any of the other songs in my database. So what I'll do here is I'll create an additional song for that artist, and maybe I'll call it a different title. I'll say call me maybe, and its play count is probably a lot higher, and we'll say it's like slightly different length. Cool. So now when I visit this songs/song ID, and actually I need to call this something different. If actually, do I need to assign that a variable at all? No, I don't. So this this song will exist, but we really only want to see the content for the song whose page we're visiting, or the song for the page that we're visiting. So I can say expect page to not have content. Oh, I do need a variable for that, song2.title. Assign that to song2 equals. And it is good practice. I just realized I didn't add bangs to my creates here. It's good practice to add these so that if anything goes wrong with our test setup, then it gives us a more helpful error. So now I should have an artist. I should have 2 songs for that artist. And when I visit the song page for this song on line 11, I should see that song's title, but I should not see song2 title. I should see I really like you. I should not see call me maybe. Let's see if we can run this test. Expected to find text, I really like you in empty string. So this is telling me that we got to the page, but it didn't have the content that we are expecting on line 16. So let's go back over to our show view. And that makes sense, right? We don't have anything here at all. If we think back to the index page video that we did, that Brian posted, in order to display a list of songs, we had to set that to an instance variable. This is the way, an instance variable is the way that we share information from the controller to the view. So what I'm going to set up here is @song. I would like to be able to call @song in my view and say song.title and render that in ERB HTML. But in order to get one particular song instead of all the songs, I'll need to use an active record method called find. I can say song, so the name of the class, .find, that's the name of the active record method. And find is going to expect the song ID. So maybe asking yourself, where are we going to get the song ID from? Like, how do we expose that to the controller? Well, this is going to take us back to the routes file. So I'll pull that up on the side here. And if you think back to when we defined these routes, we talked about this being a dynamic value. We can put anything in here. We can put 1, we can put 50, we can put the string Jameson, this can be anything. So what is the point of a dynamic segment? Well, it's to be able to take values from the URL that is typed into the browser, take values from the path, and then use them in the controller. And we do that with something called the Params object. So what I'm going to do instead of just type this out is I'll throw a binding.pry right here, and this will stop when I run my test, or at least it should. Perfect. So now here I am in this binding.pry. When we're in a controller, we have access to something called the params object. So I can just type that here and say params. That's the keyword. And it will send back this action controller object that looks a lot like a hash. and we have which controller we're going to. So the key is controller and the value is songs. We're going to the songs controller. Then we have the action as a key and show as a value. We're going to the show action in the controller. And then we have an ID, and the ID value that's getting passed here is 3. This key ID is coming from the dynamic segment in the route. And then the value is whatever we are passing back when we actually type in a value here. Like if a user is going into the browser and typing /songs/3, then the value in the hash of the params object is going to be 3, the actual value that they typed in. So this is how we can give things a name or a label, and then allow that to be dynamic, and then use those values to determine what we render in the view ultimately. The way that I would access this is just with hash notation. I could say song.find params ID, and that should grab me 3. And this active record method song.find will say, hey, active record, go to the database, get me the song with the ID of 3. And then we're assigning that to the instance variable. And if I go over here to the show index, I should be able to do a rendered ERB tag at song.title. And that should show up on our page now. So I'm going to take out this binding.pry. I'm going to exit out of the pry in my, my terminal. And just by exiting out of that pry, we ran into this active record, record not found, could not find a song without an ID. So this is reflective of before I put in the params ID here, like so. Couldn't find a song without an ID. Now that I have this here, let's run the test again and see what happens. And my test passed. So that's awesome. Before we move on, I'm going to go ahead and put in a binding.pry. And what I'll do is change my test so that now instead of going to song ID, songs slash songs slash song ID, I'm going to say something, something, something. I'm going to take out these expectations because I'm not writing a real test here. I'm just doing this to demonstrate how the dynamic segments in the routes file work. So I could say, after I visit there, I could say visit songs. Let's see, songs show me a specific song. And maybe I have get songs show me. And I'll call this, this isn't really how I would write a route. I'm doing this to demonstrate, you know, what is possible with how the DSL is set up. I'll just call this foo. And this can also go to songs, or we'll say this goes to songs custom. And I'm going to need to define a custom action in my controller and put a binding.pry there as well. Now, if I run this test, it's going to go to these kind of goofy URIs that I defined over here. This should still match to line 4, songs, and then a dynamic value for the ID. This should match to line 5, where I have /songs/show me as the static segments of the route. And then I have a dynamic segment called foo, and I'm just passing in this a_specific_song. So let me demonstrate that real quick here. I think it's pretty easy. Well, I'll leave these 2 open. I think that's best. So I'm hitting the binding.pry in the show. And now if I look at my params, I have an ID of something, something, something. And continue out of that. Couldn't find an ID of something, something, something. So that errored out. I'm going to comment out that visit and then run this again. This should match line 5 of the routes file. And if I say params, now I have a key of foo and a value of a_specific_song. So hopefully that was another helpful demonstration of how we can utilize the params object in conjunction with dynamic route segments. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this, uncomment this, and go back to what we had, which was interpolating song.id. I'm going to get out of this test and remove the extraneous method here, as well as the binding.pry on line 7. And let's go ahead and run our test. I expect this to be back to passing at this point. Great. So our test passes. We're going to go over to the show spec now. Oh, and I forgot to uncomment these, so I'll run that test one more time. And the next thing that I want to test and build is that it will display the name of the artist for a song. So now I'm going to move this test from a pending test to an actual one, and I will copy everything here because that's all the same. I'll need an artist, I'll need a couple of songs, and I'll need to visit the song show page by going to /songs/song.id. And now I can expect page to have content artist.name because we want this page to also display the artist for that song. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this commented out user story here. I think we basically have the test written that we need. And now I'm going to run this test, but I know that this test is passing. So I'm going to start the test on 15. I'll do that by giving this a colon and saying 15. And I expect this test to fail. It does. It says expected to find text Carly Rae Jepsen in I Really Like You. So this exists on the page. This doesn't. We're going to fix that. So now I have this song title, and I think because it's best practice, I'm going to wrap this in a semantic HTML tag. I'm going to say H1. And then here, I think I'll use a paragraph tag. So a fun little shortcut in Atom is you can just type the P and then tab, and it'll create those for you. I think you could do the same thing with like H1 tab. Yep. So there I have my paragraph tag. And here what I'm going to do is create another ERB rendered ERB tag and say song.artist.name. So this should display the song title in header text and then the artist underneath. And I think I will go ahead and give this a value of artist, or not a value, but I'm going to put in the HTML here, artist colon, and then we'll basically interpolate with ERB the actual name of the artist for that song. So let's run our test again. And everything passes. So that's great. I think one more thing I would like to show is save and open page. So I mentioned Launchy earlier in the lesson or in the video, save and open page. If I put that on line 21 and then I run my test, I will get this nifty little pop-up window, which I will bring over here. And you can now see essentially what Capybara is seeing. You can confirm visually that we have the name of the song and then we have the artist here. So that's pretty cool, very useful for debugging and just kind of getting a quick human eye on what it is that you're building and testing in our spec. One last thing, I think I'm going to start my Rails server and interact with this in the browser. So if I could potentially get, there we go. I can go to localhost 3000 and say songs. I don't have any songs in my database, so maybe this is something that I should do before I demonstrate all. I'll actually use what we call the Rails console. So just like you can say Rails server or Rails S, we can use Rails console to interact with our development database, right? So just like we had to create songs to see them on the index in the last video, here I'm going to create an artist and create a song so that when I go to the song show page, I can just visually kind of interact with that and see that it works. So first I'll say artist.create, and I think I'll do Prince, and then I'll do song.create, and I'll say title is raspberry beret, play count is hot, and then length is something. Oh, and I will also need an artist ID, artist.last. And I just know that the last artist that I created is the correct one in this case. So I'm just going to use artist.last. Oops, what did it not like? Oh, I gave it the whole artist instead of saying artist ID is artist.last.id. So I could do this. I think I can also use the active record association to just say artist : and then give it a whole artist object. So let's see if that works. That's too long of a play count. So we will, looks better. So now I'll say song.all and artist.all. I should make another song by Prince just to make sure that it's displaying all the correct information. I don't see a title for a different song when I visit that show page. So we'll say first Prince song that came to my mind. And I will exit out of here and restart my Rails server. So now if I go to the songs index, I can see Raspberry Beret with the play count and the length and Ronnie Talked to Russia. So all the stuff that Brian built in the last video. But now if I go to songs 1, I think that should be Raspberry Beret. And we have the title and we have the artist. And if I go to song 2, same thing. Thanks for hanging in there with me. That's all I have for today. I will leave off with a few questions just to kind of get you thinking about the way that this all works in Rails. The first question that I will ask you to think about is, why would you use a dynamic segment in your routes? We have one example here with the song show page, but what could be another reason? Or what could be a few other reasons? The next thing is, how is the params object generated? We saw how to interact with it. We saw the information that we can get from the params object depending upon how we set up our tests and how we set up our routes. So try to spend some time thinking about how that is working. How is the params object coming into existence when you're writing your applications? And then what active record method could we use to retrieve a specific resource? So maybe I wanted to build out an artist show page next. If I have an ID for an artist in the params object, how would I use that ID with active record to get a particular artist from our database? And that will be it. Thanks for watching.